This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Te Motu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. Hi, this is the last reserved recommendations for this year, and quite frankly, it might be the last reserved recommendations overall. We'll see. I have, as we have all, had a year, and part of that has been that I've had a bit of a hard time finding people who want to come on this podcast and talk to me about problematic faves. And, fair enough. There is a lot happening in the world, many events, many such cases. I think it's entirely reasonable if people do not want to have flippant little conversations with me on the side. That is absolutely fine. And things have a lifespan, you know. If this project has come to the end of that lifespan, then so be it. I guess what I'm calling for is if you don't think this project has come to the end of its lifespan and you would like to hear more of it and you would maybe like to be on it, get in touch with me. My contact details as regards the show are in the end matter of the podcast, so get in touch with me all of those ways. I am also now findable on Blue Sky. I am Objective Realty there, as I am on basically every social media platform, or you can search for me by my government name, Hugh Dingwall, if you prefer. Anyway, what I have planned for you this episode is another minisode in the vein of the one that I did about dealing with authors becoming shitbags in real time in front of you. That was mostly about Neil Gaiman, but also about the experience of being a fan of Warren Ellis, and kind of by extension, you know, how we deal with that. This is, I guess, a more general talk about where I feel like we are, particularly in Aotearoa New Zealand, with our politics, but I don't know, this might have broader applications. I guess the thing to know if you're a non-New Zealand listener to this is that our government operates on MMP, which is mixed member proportional representation. What that means is that you're almost guaranteed to get a coalition government. There is not really, like, people still kind of vote as if we lived in a two-party state, because before MMP, functionally we did. We had Labour and National, which are analogous to the UK Labour Party and the UK Conservative Party, more or less. But since the advent of MMP, we have had very few cases where a government is able to form from one party alone, and minor parties like ACT, New Zealand First, the Greens, the Māori Party, all have been exercising more and more influence over subsequent decades, to the point where realistically I think that people should start treating them as like major components of a prospective government. They shouldn't be thinking about, do we want National or Labour? They should really be thinking about, do we want ACT? Do we want New Zealand First? Do we want Te Pāti Māori? Do we want the Greens? Because those parties in particular are going to be pretty much guaranteed components of any given government, and there are other minor parties who might well meet that 5% threshold. So you have to get 5% of the total vote to get into Parliament. You never know. we could be dealing with another party on the left or the right, or a weird centrist thing like New Zealand First claimed to be before they went hard right this time around. So, all of which is to say that all of the comments that I'm about to make are quite specifically about the New Zealand government, but they're kind of about a way of thinking and governing, which might have broader applications if you don't live here. So the first concept that I want to introduce is a thing that I'm swiping from my friend Morgan Davey. Morg is a very intelligent person. You can listen to he and I have a conversation about the movie Under the Skin if you check back on the YouTube archive of this podcast. That's one of my favorite episodes I've done. I think that we had a really interesting conversation about that movie, and we identified some really interesting areas that neither of us felt like we were qualified to comment on, but that we kind of desperately wanted someone who was better qualified to comment on. Anyway, that's a good episode. You should check it out. Morg's been using this term on Blue Sky primarily is where I see him. The government of reckons, by which he means that the current New Zealand government, which is majority the National Party, supported by New Zealand First and ACT, are essentially making sort of speculative claims of the kind that you might hear someone pontificate in a pub, and then actioning those as though they are concrete and provable policy prescriptions. They just kind of reckon stuff and then they do it. And that's led me, I thought that that was a really good description of the way that this government has behaved, because I think that if you honestly analyse them from a right-wing perspective, you would find that their actions don't make a lot of sense. Their actions aren't particularly good for the economy. New Zealand's economy has been suffering. Their actions aren't particularly good for business. Business is having a hard time. They're having a harder time than they were having under the Labour Party. The general state of the world is not better from a right-wing perspective than it was under the Labour Party. Obviously, you could critique them from the left as well. But my point really is that I don't think that anything that they do makes much sense from any kind of ideological standpoint. I think the only way to understand what they're doing is if you look at each policy announcement as kind of a reckon about the way that the world ought to be. It's just someone's hot take. Or cold take, really. You know, someone's like warmed over 1960s take, and then it's treated as a policy prescription. Which has led me to, I guess, a conversation that I would like to have with you all, that I would like to sort of slightly pretentiously title Against Common Sense. So the first thing that obviously we need to nail down is what I mean by common sense in this case. And what I mean is conclusions that are arrived at without too much thought, that feel emotionally satisfying if you agree with them, and don't really challenge any underlying assumptions about the world. So if you think, for example, about someone who says off the cuff, well, obviously there are only two genders. Actually, anyone who does any serious work about sociology or social history or anthropology or even biological or genetic science knows that the actual case around sex and gender is a hell of a lot more complicated than that. But there are only two genders and those align with sexes is like a primary school 20 years ago understanding of how the world works. And it's emotionally satisfying if you don't believe in it, because if you do believe in it, because anyone who says anything more complicated than that is is acting counter to common sense. They can be dismissed without necessarily having to consider their points. I think similarly, you look at people who, like bumper sticker slogans are a great source of this stuff, right? I saw a bumper sticker that said, if you can't feed them, don't breed them. You know, like if you have more kids than you can afford, you shouldn't have that many kids. It's emotionally satisfying. It absolves you of needing to think about the situation that many people live in, grinding poverty, and many of the people who do that are children. But the moment that you think about it for a second, it suggests that if someone's economic circumstances change, you know, if I was making $100,000 a year and then I become disabled and I am now reliant on some sort of a benefit and I am now living on, say, $40,000 a year, what am I supposed to do with the children that I had when I had $100,000 a year? Are they supposed to vanish into a pocket dimension until I have more money? Am I supposed to send them to stay with richer relatives? Am I supposed to eat them? Like, there's no analysis behind a comment like that. It's pure complacent knee-jerkery. And I think that kind of common sense is kind of key to understanding the flaws of both mainstream right and mainstream left politics at the moment, particularly in New Zealand, but probably further afield. So, on the right to start with, because to be clear, I am a lefty, and I prefer poking the right to poking the left, but on the right first, I think you can sum up a lot of what this government has done with, like, looking at the intoxicating appeal to the right of the term woke. Woke is doing the job that PC Gone Mad used to do, and the purpose that it serves is that if you call something woke or PC Gone Mad, you do not need to explain any further to people who also agree that that nebulous term is a problem. You will note that it is very difficult for someone who disapproves of woke as a collective term to clearly define what is and is not woke. You had the absolute spectacle of David Seymour of the ACT Party attempting to classify foods into woke and anti-woke when he made his initial announcements about changing school lunches. That is a feature, not a bug, right? Because it's just a vibe of things that I feel like I don't like for reasons that I'm not really willing to get into. And that makes it incredibly useful for activating a base whose concerns are quite nebulous, because I suspect to think more deeply about them would be to have some uncomfortable feelings about themselves and the country they live in. So some examples of this kind of thinking from the current government. The school lunches I already mentioned. The school lunches in New Zealand were brought in under the previous Labour government. They were locally sourced. The arrangements, I think, were done on a school-by-school basis. It may have been like a region-by-region basis, but the important thing was that the food was sourced locally, so it supported local business. It arrived at the school very quickly after it had been made. There was some wastage, because there's always wastage when you try and feed children, because some children are picky little bastards. But by and large, it was working pretty well, and the advantage of it was that there was a broad enough spectrum of things that most people ate something most of the time, and it was universally applicable to everyone because because there was no eligibility criteria. Rich kids got it, poor kids got it, didn't matter. That's been reviewed by the current government, and I believe the ACT Party led that. David Seymour had this whole thing about getting rid of woke foods like quinoa. That's pretty much a direct quote. What does it matter whether a kid eats quinoa or a ham sandwich in terms of actual brain function and nutrition? The important thing is a kid who might not have had anything to eat and thus wouldn't be able to focus and function at school gets something to eat. The actual plan makes food for schools much worse by centralizing it to a single supplier and then distributing it around the country, which means that food will absolutely not arrive fresh, and that schools will then have to work out ways of heating it and storing it, which they never had to do before because it came from a local supplier and turned up just in time. So the actual thing has been made worse. It's probably not going to be cheaper, but the motivating force is the sort of commonsensical idea that some foods are woke and effete and some are normal people food, and we should be giving kids normal people food because ? Similarly, there's been the massive push to prevent any kind of infrastructure going in, which might favour cycleways over roading. That comes at the same time as, frankly, punitive legislation aimed at EV owners. Now, I understand and actually support the idea that EV owners probably should be paying a bit more for road maintenance, because part of that's built into fuel taxes for people who drive petrol cars. That's kind of fair enough. Like EV cars are not lighter than petrol cars, they still wear the roads. But the level that's been done at is clearly designed to be punitive to people who thought that getting an EV was a good idea. And really, the only logic there is that they're trying to directly appeal to the sort of person who shares anti-EV, anti-cyclist memes on Facebook. Those people do not have a consistent or really ideological or coherently thought out position against bikes or electric vehicles. They are reactively mad at something that they feel like in some nebulous way is scolding them merely by existing. We have new directives on free speech, which actually in effect force universities to run their free speech policies by the government and submit those for approval. So in effect what that's saying is that we have to carve out space on university campuses for speech which is approved of by the government or by one of the coalition partners in the government, which is not free speech, that goes without saying. And that comes at the same time as an attack on government funding for the humanities. Again, that is straightforwardly nonsense, because it doesn't, you're not saving a meaningful amount of money, you're not protecting a genuinely attacked class of person. The only context in which that makes sense is if you assume that it is calculated to hurt a group of people that the base commonsensically, knee-jerk reactively considers to be in some way a threat. In this case, the concept of an intellectual elite who look down their noses at real people and sneer at us and tell us what to do. That's not a real class of person in any meaningful sense, right? Like, humanities professors genuinely don't have the power to do any harm. Not on a nationwide scale. They might write books that are bad and people might pick them up, but they can't control your speech or thought or tell you what you can and can't wear or do or drive or anything like that. Attacking those academic institutions really only serves the purpose of hurting the feelings of people who deserve to get their feelings hurt because they value their feelings too much, apparently. It's got no basis except in this, as I say, common sense idea that there are real people and people who are not real people. I believe that this is the same thing that drives the run of anti-Māori legislation that we've seen. It is true that the 1970s saw the creation of this concept of the principles of te tiriti, and that those are kind of nebulous in some ways and could probably do with an academic discussion of some sort that pushes them to be more coherent, because there are arguments from Tino Rangatirotanga's perspective that the principles of the treaty or the principles of te tiriti have been used as kind of a whitewash on attempts to limit Māori contributions into lawmaking. But what the ACT Party has proposed is an incredibly limited set of principles of te tiriti, which bakes into law the presumption that all ongoing partnership issues between the Crown and iwi and hapu are settled forever. That is transparently nonsense. If you look at the hikoi that turned out, you can see that is not settled. That was an incredibly powerful collective action from a really broad base of New Zealanders, and absolutely not just Māori, who were really wound up by this. So transparently, collectively as a country, we don't think this is settled. However, this common sense contingent says this is hundreds of years ago, obviously it's settled, Māori just need to move on. The final thing that I want to talk about in the context of this common sense, kind of complacent point of view is something that I mentioned right back at the start, the idea of like two genders. I think this appeal to common sense without consideration of the actual facts is a big part of what makes New Zealand vulnerable to the transphobic rhetoric coming out, particularly from the UK, because that relies on a really basic and reductive idea about gender, which doesn't rely on you having any further thought about anything that you've learned since primary school. And again, as I said at the start, if you talk to people who work in sociology, if you talk to people who work in anthropology, if you talk to people who work in biology or genetics, they will tell you that sex and gender is a lot more complicated than the pink for girls, blue for boys model. And even the colours pink for blue and for girls and blue for boys are not consistent within Anglosphere Western culture much longer than a couple hundred of years ago. The way that gender is expressed in humans is really, really varied across cultures, which tells us straightforwardly that it's not basic biology. It tells us really straightforwardly that all around the world and all across history, there have been people who do not fit a simple binary model of gender, and various cultures have come up with various norms and conventions and concepts of gender as a way of accommodating or excluding or attempting to control those people. I'm not by any means trying to say that, the rest of the world is a paradise with this stuff. I'm just saying that what you can see across the world and across history is attempt after attempt after attempt to grapple with it and figure out some sort of schema for the world which makes it make sense. And the schema which goes, there are two binary genders, everything that's outside of that is a fairy tale, is a very, in terms of global history, recent Western invention, which has been spread largely by colonialism, and really only serves any purpose in terms of reinforcing the sort of household dynamic that makes factory capitalism functional. Now that factory capitalism isn't really the kind of capitalism that we deal with anymore, at least, here in Aotearoa, for most people, even that makes less and less sense. There's no real reason that you need a woman to support a household and a man to work. It doesn't really make any sense. Anyway, we are going to take a break, and then I am going to put my boot into the left for just a little bit before I wrap things up.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
You're listening to Manawatu People's Radio Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. This is community access media for Palmerston North and the Manawatu, of course, podcasting across the world with the assistance of the Access Media NZ project and the support of New Zealand On Air. So cheers for that, guys. I've just spent just shy of half an hour putting a boot into the right for their current attachment to what I'm calling common sense, somewhat cheekily, as a kind of framework for, I guess, an anti-intellectual, anti-thought, anti-consideration style of politics, which I feel is quite is at the core of a lot of what our current government in New Zealand is doing, but I think it's probably got applications broader afield. I want to turn now to the left because there is a similar, counter tendency on the left to want to return with a V to some sort of prelapsarian unions for all golden age, and I think that can be as toxic in its own way. The primary issue with it is that if you look at the era in New Zealand politics when unions were really powerful and we had socialist governments, that was a time that sucked for a lot of people, actually. That was not a great time to be a woman. That was absolutely not a good time to be gay. It was such a bad time to be trans that trans history from that era is largely invisible because those people stayed invisible or died in many cases. You cannot attempt to turn the clock back to the era where one man's income was enough to support his wife and children without acknowledging the inherent sexism, heteronormativity, and if the fact that presumed man is likely white, right? New Zealand has had a huge amount of immigration from countries all over the world, and our culture is much richer for it. That the fact that immigration has been in some ways deliberately done to try and keep a lid on wages in some industries, try and weaken the bargaining power of workers in some industries, actually doesn't change that. So we can't become paranoid about immigration without being very, very, very careful that we are not playing into racist tropes about immigrants stealing our jobs. And that's been a mainstream strategy on the left, or at least the centre left, as recently as the election before last, the Labour Party were trying to make a point about home ownership. I think a fundamentally good point about home ownership being controlled by a sort of a landlord class, but they decided to do that in the framing of being worried about foreign buyers, because they did not want to turn the torch on homegrown New Zealand landlords who were profiteering on the housing crisis and continue to do so. And then they specifically went further than that and went searching through electoral records for Chinese-sounding names, which is just such a spectacularly misguided approach that it fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the problem, right? Honestly, were I still living in rented accommodation, I could not care less if my landlord was a Pākehā, was Māori, was Chinese, was Korean, whatever. What I care about is how high is my rent, what state is the building in which I live. Those are the things that matter to renters. It really doesn't make any difference if overseas people are buying our property as an investment, or if local people are buying our property as an investment. If property is an investment more than houses are a place for people to live, then we are going to have a continuing and escalating housing crisis. If we continue to put the responsibility for building new houses and connecting those houses with people who want to own them in the hands of commercial developers, then we're going to continue having an escalating housing crisis, because developers are going to continue building whatever is the most profitable thing to build, whether or not that's the most efficient way of housing people. Again, part of that return left-wing dream is the idea of the quarter-acre paradise, right? Everyone gets to have their single occupancy home with a section that they can grow a productive garden on because they have time to grow a productive garden and the skills to grow a productive garden, and gardening is a thing that they want to do with the precious minutes of life that they have. All of those are, of course, are assumptions. And I don't know that with a growing population that is a feasible use of land. I live in Palmerston North. We are a splattered out, low population city with lots of space for not that many people. You can probably do that here for a while. But even here, with new developments, we are infilling in the middle of the city with more dense development. Because the other thing that Palmerston North has is just scads of parkland. So if you want to let your kids or your dog go for a run somewhere, there are plenty of places to do that. We have, actually, a reasonable number of community gardens that you can participate in and get access to fresh veggies and skills that way. And increasingly, gardening is... I've got to be very careful here, But gardening is not necessarily a thing that everybody wants to do, nor should it be a prerequisite to being able to survive. Human societies have always had ways of selling people food in ways that are affordable. It has never been the case that absolutely everyone has to grow everything they eat. That is a very much like immediately post-war idea that was based in the conditions of the time, and to treat that as commonsensically the way that we must go forward in order for people to be living good lives, I think is short-sighted and excludes a lot of people. I want to link this to a couple of ideas actually, from Cory Doctorow. I read his book, The Lost Cause, recently, and I also have been listening to his podcast for a long time. He is primarily someone who writes about tech, but often his insights about tech, I think, expand further than that and have applications in other places. The thing that I want to talk about specifically from his podcast is he's talking in the context of how we deal with the massive tech platforms and the way that they have constructed the modern internet. Specifically, he cautions against nostalgia for the old good internet. So what he calls the old good internet is basically the pre-social platform period, where the internet was or the social internet was a series of forums dedicated to specific areas of interest. So if you were interested in a particular thing, you would go and check out the forum for that thing and you would engage in conversations there. And it would be quite common for someone who has broad interests to be signed up to a bunch of different forums and go and hang out in various different ones, depending on what they wanted to talk about, or to connect with a website like Something Awful, or another broader based website, like often websites devoted to a particular topic, like RPGNet for role-playing games, would have off-topic forums where you could talk about stuff that wasn't the core purpose of the website, but again, that would be sorted by interest. And the point of the old good internet was that it was you didn't have to have every conversation in the public square. You could have conversations with people who wanted to talk about the thing that you were specifically interested about in an area that was siloed off for that kind of conversation. It also meant that if you behaved like a jerk, you could find yourself banned from a website very quickly. And that meant that people who had particularly vile beliefs tended to get siloed off to their own dark little corners of the internet, rather than having those vile beliefs out in public, again, in the public square, because there wasn't really the same kind of public square. And Cory Doctorow's point is that the old good internet actually wasn't good for everyone. It was really hostile to women and a bunch of minority groups. It allowed like millions of private room structures allowed some of those private rooms to get super weird and super unpleasant, and for people to invest a lot of energy in what are, like, in retrospect, quite arcane disagreements and beefs and like inter-website wars. And all of that stuff was really negative. What Doctorow calls for is a new good internet, which is what can we take from the current internet that is good? What can we take from the old good internet, reframed through the perspective of the way that we think now? You know, the old good internet, but reframed in a way which is much more genuinely inclusive, which uses much better safety tools, which uses much better accessibility tools. How can we do that to create a new good internet? And I think that is where we need to be thinking in terms of left-wing politics. We can't go back to the old good time, because the old good time wasn't actually that good for a whole swathe of people. And the old good time was based on some assumptions which are no longer sustainable. The idea of the single family, single occupancy dwelling is going to become increasingly tenuous as less land is usable and more land is needed for food production, for example. The idea of everyone having a private vehicle is going to become less tenable as the number of private vehicles that would be needed to service any given population reaches a certain limit and then goes past it. And if you try and drive in a major city in New Zealand, I would argue that we are already hitting that point in some places, notably Auckland. And more roads can never solve that problem. So how do we create a new good left-wing politics that has space for people in all of their diversity in it? And how do we then articulate that vision, and this is the bit that I think is really important, in a way that is attractive to people? So I mentioned that I had been reading The Lost Cause. The Lost Cause is a near-future science fiction, social fiction, speculative fiction story. There's not a huge amount of science fiction in it, aside from some technology that doesn't exist yet, but it's not really that far out of plausibility. Basically, it's a story set in a near climate changed future about how we deal with the generation who are, in the timeline of the story, grandparents and great-grandparents who are tied to the very regressive, common sense right-wing politics of the past. And one of the things that book gets into is essentially like guerrilla urban planning, but the way that, without spoiling the story too much, the way that the heroes win is not through having a rhetorical or even a rhetorical or physical confrontation with the bad guys. There is kind of a physical showdown, sort of, at the end, but he makes a point of having violence very much be counterproductive even when the good guys attempt to do it. The way that they win is by outmaneuvering their opposition in terms of presenting a future and a city where people want to live. So I think it's very easy when a right-wing government is doing painfully regressive and stupid things to want to call out every painfully stupid and regressive thing that they do as they do it. But the challenge that I would issue to politics on the left, so politicians and political commentators on the left, is obviously you do need to call dumb bullshit. Like you can't let people do things and not call them on it. And particularly if you're in a journalist space, then that's your job, right? To react to things as they happen. If you are reporting, then you are reporting, not providing opinion. Providing opinion is a different thing. But if you are a politician, you need to be not just critiquing what the current government is doing, you need to be articulating how you would do it better. And the two parties that I think actually do that at the moment in New Zealand politics are Te Pāti Māori and the Greens. I do not see a lot of that from Labour. I did not see a lot of that from Labour on the last election. I saw a lot of tweaking things in very minor ways around the edges. One of the things that our local candidate, God bless him, good bloke, but our local candidate here in Palmerston North, Tangi Utakere, was trumpeting was a change to laws around domestic violence to make strangulation a specific crime. Now, strangulation is a horrible thing to do to someone. Making it in some way more possible to take domestic violence more seriously as a society, all of those things absolutely worthwhile doing. And this was a law change that was, supported gratefully by outfits like Women's Refuge. So I'm not going to say it was a bad thing. What I am going to say is that is not very compelling, because assaulting someone is already illegal. Making a very specific kind of assault somewhat more illegal is not really the same thing as saying, we envision a world without domestic violence. Here are the steps we're going to try and take to move in that direction. Like, that's the difference that I'm talking about, and that kind of vision is something that, as I say, on the left, I currently only see from Te Pāti Māori and the Greens, and you can agree or disagree with their vision, but they're the only people who seem to be doing it. And the one thing that you absolutely have to say about the centre-right at the moment is they set out a bunch of things they wanted to do, and they have gone ahead and done them. And they have not let public opposition stop them doing that. And they have done a bunch of dumb things, and they have looked stupid over and over again, as journalists have said, this dumb thing has done the opposite of what the government said it would do. But they haven't stopped. They're still doing it. And I must needs remind New Zealanders in particular that the Labour Party had an absolute majority under Jacinda Ardern for a while. They could have, if they wanted, ridden roughshod over any objection from the right to anything that they wanted to do. They could have absolutely behaved like this government is currently behaving, but from the left, and they chose not to. Because fundamentally, I don't think that they had a vision, even a bad vision. I think fundamentally they thought, tighten a few nuts and bolts, turn a few knobs in a few places, no major change needed. And I think that's a criminal lack of vision. Anyway, I hope that this conversation, or monologue rather, has been useful to you. If it has, if you would like me to keep doing this, get in touch. You can send me emails to my work email at hugh@mpr.nz. You can find me on Blue Sky under my government name, Hugh Dingwall, or I believe my handle is Objective Realty. I may have got Objective Reality. Check both. If you find it's a blue skull with a little flower on it, that's me. I am still on Twitter. I have not deleted my account yet. I am likely going to do it. Probably don't get in touch on Twitter, but if you want to, go ahead. You can also find the radio show and podcast on Facebook, and you can send a message through that page or use that to get hold of my personal Facebook and send me messages that way. I am not a hard person to find. In the meantime, look after yourselves and each other. Incidentally, if you've enjoyed the background music for this episode, that is part of an electronic music project that I have been working on for the last few months. The idea is to create some sonic spaces that you can kind of hang out in and chill. Specifically, I was motivated by my wife, who has sensory issues as part of her health conditions. having a hard time with people like mowing lawns and running power tools, and I was trying to find something that she could play in headphones that would just kind of give her a break from that. So if you've enjoyed that, look for wolfboy.bandcamp.com. That's where I release my music, and I will probably put out a release of all of these tracks real soon. I'm not sure exactly when, but I'm guessing likely early in the new year. In the meantime, look after yourselves and each other. Ka kite anō. You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.